Hi, I'm Meta Spencer. Well, shall we go to Malta or shall we go to Geneva today? I've got people in both places, and it's wonderful, isn't it? We can talk to people in Europe so easily. The thing I want to do is find out whatever happened to the CSCE. Because back in the 80s, I was very involved with something called the Helsinki Citizens Assembly. And I was going to Europe about 3 times a year to these meetings. Well, we had the idea that there was something called the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, the CSCE, that was going to be a very important institution of international governance for many, many countries. So practically all the countries in the Northern Hemisphere belonged. Maybe exaggerating, but it was a lot of countries, including Canada and Europe and Russia and the US and a lot of folks. And we thought, this is what's going to fill the gap after the Cold War, because we're going to all get together and sing Kumbaya. But it didn't happen. At least I don't think it has, as far as I know. But this organization, the CSCE, became something called the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And I have not, I mean, they do things, good things, wonderful things, but I don't see the kind of power that I thought was going to be there. So I have invited 2 people who really know their way around this outfit. And we're going to have a conversation about the OSCE today. And so here, Fred Tanner is going to be with us in Geneva. He is a retired Swiss ambassador to the OSCE, where he was a senior advisor to the Secretary General. Pretty good. He was former head, and now he's a fellow at the Geneva Center for Security Policy. So hello, Fred. How are you?
Hi, Meta. I'm fine. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, it's wonderful to meet you. And we get to also now go to Malta, where I get to talk to Monica Wohlfeld. Monica is the German chair for peace studies and conflict prevention at the Mediterranean Academy of Diplomatic Studies in Malta, which I understand is connected with the University of Malta. And I believe that Fred Tanner was there also some years before. So, and they work together in some ways. They've just written a paper together, which we'll maybe mention later on. Hello, Monica. How are you?
Hello, Meta. Thank you. Very well.
Yeah, it's wonderful to meet you. It's also, I was surprised and pleased to know that you did your undergraduate work, I believe, at the University of Calgary, right?
Yes, both undergraduate and my master's as well.
Really good.
Yeah.
Well, you see,
Educated in Canada.
it's a rare thing for a German to come to Canada to find out what we do when you do a very interesting lot of things there too. Okay, so let's get down to work. I want to find out more about what happened. You got to educate me and bring me up to date, and you can just assume that I'm really totally ignorant, because I'm pretty much am, about the structure of the OSCE. Main times I hear about it now is when the OSCE sends election monitors to countries that have some question about the the fairness of the elections, right? So beyond that, I don't know what you guys do. Monica, why don't you kick it off and tell me what the hell is the OSCE these days, and is it a fun organization to join?
Yes, well, let me go back maybe to the end of the Cold War, since you mentioned the 1980s. I mentioned the idea of a peace dividend. You know, the Warsaw Treaty Organization disintegrating, questions about the purpose of NATO. The EU is still a very small framework, and the CSC, and later since 1994 the OSCE, seen as a possible framework that could actually bring these 2 different parts of Europe together in a cooperative way. This didn't last very long, because first of all, already in the early 90s, a number of conflicts emerged in the former Soviet Union and then former Yugoslavia. And so while, the thinking was going on about lofty ideas, the reality on the ground quickly deteriorated. But then it also became very clear that other organizations were there to stay, that they had their agendas, that states were not willing to throw the weight behind the CSC and the OSCE because they didn't believe that it would fulfill their interest and their expectations. So the organization developed in a much more curtailed way, but it did develop. It did develop to be what it is today, which is the largest regional organization in the world, with a huge agenda that spans issues from political, military to the economy, the environment, human rights, elections. And that brings so many states together around one table.
Tell me when it was founded, because I actually don't remember that, as the CSCE. How did it get started? And, it was quite remarkable that so many countries belonged at the time, early on. And I presume they still belong. I mean, has any country ever dropped out?
No, not to my knowledge. In fact, countries were rather added on. It grew rather than shrink. For example, Mongolia joined as a participating state just some years ago.
Oh, yeah.
But how it started? Well, it started in the 1970s during the Helsinki negotiations. In 1975, the Helsinki Final Act was signed. That was a document that is still at the base of everything that OSCE does. And it is considered to be a document or an agreement that has helped to overcome the Cold War, that has contributed to the end of this sort of divisions. The Iron Curtain came down not only because of it, but also because of it.
Was it structured from the same as it is now from the get-go?
No. Initially, it was just a set of negotiating frameworks. That's why it was called a conference. It didn't have a structure. It didn't have a budget. It didn't really have a staff beyond just a small group of people who were supporting these negotiations and these conferences. It emerged as an organization in the 90s. So as a consequence of the end of the Cold War, and of course all the conflicts that were emerging in its area.
Well, when I knew about it, I don't think there was even a secretariat. It was just like a traveling roadshow, was something like that, right?
Yes.
Now, there is, I presume there is a secretariat, and that I think it's in Vienna.
Yes, there is a secretariat that's in Vienna. It's not huge. Unlike, for example, the United Nations, that has a very solid structure and a large staff and a large budget, that is not the case.
Fred, so you were posted in Vienna for a while, I gather.
Actually, I was not representing Switzerland at the time. I was seconded by Switzerland as advisor to Secretary General with the title of ambassador. And also was in early 2014 when I started to take up my work in Vienna. This is going to be relatively quiet job. OSCE it's not NATO or it's not European Union. But then what happened was Maidan broke out in Ukraine, a crisis which quickly developed into an armed violence and actually a full-fledged war. And under the Swiss chairmanship at the time, the OSCE was able to react and to set up a crisis management structure. And I have been with the Secretary General, traveled to Moscow, traveled to Kiev in this very difficult period. For me, it was very interesting, of course, but also sometimes very frustrating to see, what you cannot do in the light of this escalation of hostilities and violence.
I get the impression that that's the main focus of where the OSCE has been really active over the last decade or so. Is that right? In the Ukraine-Russia conflict.
And you're absolutely right, Meta. It's that the engagement in Ukraine, which actually is on different levels. We have there a negotiation team. It's called the Trilateral Contact Group. So that's the negotiation structure. And then you have a monitoring structure too, with we call the Special Monitoring Mission, which is quite a unique mission. It's like a peace mission. And I think it's one of the largest missions the OSCE ever had. The mission now has over 1,000 monitors, particularly, of course, in the eastern part of Ukraine. They use a lot of technology for monitoring, UAVs, drones, cameras, static cameras, satellite imagery. It has an annual budget of over 100 million euros. So it's probably the largest mission in terms of resources.
I'm sorry, who had that kind of budget? Which group?
It's the SMM. It's a special monitoring mission, which is an OSCE mission in Ukraine.
Do they monitor anything besides elections, or are they? There's no real ceasefire now. That's real. Are they trying to monitor a ceasefire or what?
Yes, indeed. They monitor. They have the mandate to monitor the ceasefire. Of course, a lot of breaches and violations, but they document that every day. You can find it on their website. They bring up a report. Where's the fire coming from? Basically, just yesterday again, I think was a report that 14 Russian tanks were discovered in an area they were not supposed to be, and so they provide transparency with this reporting. Also, with regard to civilian population caught up in this conflict, let's not forget this is a front line of 500 kilometers, and people are stuck in between. And the SMM, this mission, is the only mission which really has access to both sides. They can cross from the Ukrainian-controlled area to the separatist-controlled area. They have actually offices in the rebel-controlled areas. So I think it's quite a unique mission. And of course, it's also very dangerous. It's a mission which is not armed. It's a mission which has no...
The OSCE people are not armed and can do nothing to protect themselves.
That's correct.
Do the combatants feel hostile to them?
It's a good question. I think they are appreciated because they detect, they know where landmines are. They report that to the authorities or to NGOs which work, let's see, ICRC or so. They report also if you have IDPs, so internal displaced persons. They report it to the High Commissar for Refugee agencies in the area. So they try also to work with the civilian population. But sometimes there has been certain hostilities also from civilians, because particularly on the separatist side, there was a concern that the reporting by the mission gives away certain military secrets. See, if the drones find out there's a concentration of, let's say, certain armament or artillery pieces which are not supposed to be there, and that's being reported next day on the website. Civilians don't, who feel like they need to be protected by their militaries, they are not always very happy about that.
Did I hear you say there are landmines there?
Loads of landmines everywhere.
And they've been, obviously, they must have been set in the last few years, right?
Well, yes. On the one hand, Ukraine, unfortunately, has not been party to the Ottawa Agreement, so no legal obligation to get rid of them. On the other hand, over the last few years, there has been deployment of landmines is an integral part of the defensive positions which both sides have developed along the front line. And so, again, civilians also live in the area. And I will not say every day, but there are quite a few incidences still happening with landmines. Actually, the SMM, one of the monitors died actually because of a landmine. It was an American medic who was part of the mission, and that was very tragic development.
We plunged right into talking about the hot work, the work you're doing in hotspots, without really talking about what the organization is like. What is it? I hear that I was going to interview Hedy Fry, Dr. Hedy Fry from Vancouver, I think, along with you, and she couldn't do it, but I believe she's part of the Canadian group that goes to, is it annual meetings or more frequent meetings of the OSCE?
Go all the way back to 1975 with the Helsinki Final Act, because it was actually quite remarkable at the time during the Cold War, where you had the West separated from the East, from Russia and the Russian allies through Iron Curtain. Courageous diplomats agreed on meetings and eventually on this Helsinki Final Act. And the Helsinki Final Act is basically, even today, still the basic foundation of cooperation of the organization. These are principles. These are not necessarily values, but principles. And over time, of course, this has an acquis. The kind of commitments have been growing up to today. But again, the Helsinki Final Act is actually the DNA of the organization. You had the Paris Charter, the Paris Agreement in 1990, which then created the OSCE, which then was established in 1994 as an organization. So I would call it a soft security organization. And the particular thing is really, again, it goes back to Helsinki legacy, the link between security and human rights, which is quite unique. Again, we call it comprehensive. It's a comprehensive approach to security. It's the assumption, you have been linked to some Helsinki action groups. The point is really that you cannot have security if there's no respect for human rights. And that's basically has been growing all along. It has become institutionalized. And today we have an institution. Monica referred to the Secretariat. We have three institutions like satellites floating around the Secretariat, which is the High Commissioner for National Minorities. It's the Representative Freedom of Media, and it's the Office of Democratic Institutions and Human Rights. They all have their own mandates, but they all belong to the family of the OSCE. Not all of them are in Vienna. That just shows you a bit the certain fragmentation of the organization, which can be also an advantage, as they have their own mandate and cannot be necessarily blocked by the political decision-making, which takes place in Vienna in the Hofburg, where you have all states coming together once a week on the level of ambassadors to this in the context of the Permanent Council. And that council can make decisions.
I'm sorry, once a week?
Yes.
What comes together? These three bodies connect somehow, or what?
No, all the states come together. The delegations meet once a week in the context of the Permanent Council.
The delegates from each country, they get together once a week. Oh, yes. I presume
it's actually
nowadays it's by Zoom or something, right? You don't really
used to be. Yes, you're right.
Okay, what happens in these weekly meetings? People bring up issues that they think would be violations of human rights, or what goes on?
Yes, so on the agenda certainly will be Ukraine, it will be Nagorno-Karabakh, but also Sweden has a very strong emphasis on the women, peace and security, the empowerment of women in mediation and in peace processes. So these kind of items will be on the agenda, but each country can put their own items on. And as in any kind of international organization, this is consulted. European Union countries agree on their points, NATO countries or countries close to Russia bring in their points.
The Helsinki Final Act was used as a wonderful tool by dissidents in the Soviet Union who complained about the violations of rights in their country. And it was they got in trouble for it, but they would, at least they had that to work with, because the Soviet Union had become a party to this final act. And so indeed, my recollection of that early period, at least, was that it was primarily focusing on human rights issues. But it's almost as if you're saying that that has continued to be the main focus is human rights issues, not environment issues or other whatever.
It's certainly this is as I mentioned, it's really the part of this link between security and human rights wherever you go. I mean, if you look right now, what's happening in Belarus with the crackdowns of the civil society activists and journalists who the OSCE would condemn the use of force, but would very much then zoom in on the protection of journalists, the protection of, again, to basically there are some violations of OSCE commitments with regard to human rights. And so, again, the OSCE would look at it in a more holistic perspective. If you have after 9/11, the OSCE would very much take terrorism onto the agenda. It even created a department within the Secretariat dealing with that. But again, the key is you look at terrorism in the context of root causes, in the context of awareness building in civil society, in the context of human rights too. So I think it always goes together. And I think that's how the human rights legacy has developed. Let me just mention that actually this all started again in 1975, where you had a lot of courageous people getting together, including Pierre Trudeau.
Pierre Trudeau was involved with the OSCE? I didn't know that.
Well, he was at the summit.
It would have been the CSE at that point.
Yeah, the CSE, 1975, that's right. With Brezhnev and President Ford. But then you had, as you mentioned, you had these human rights activities, which the Soviets conceded to, because they wanted to have something from the West, which was recognition of borders, and the Soviet Union had to give space for human rights. That's why you had developments of human rights groups within the Soviet area. And courageous people then, of course, like Sakharov or Václav Havel, and this kind of people, they all kind of were benefiting from this Helsinki legacy. And I think in a way it's still alive today.
Mm-hmm. Monica, you have part of your title involves conflict prevention. So that must mean that you have been engaged in particular conflicts. Where have you worked in that way?
So my last position in the OSCE was Deputy Director of the Conflict Prevention Center. And the Conflict Prevention Center supports and works with the field operations of the organization. Fred already mentioned the monitoring mission in Ukraine, but there's a number of them, and there's some that have disappeared since. If I may mention the most interesting ones that I was working on, it would be the Kosovo verification mission, which was, again, a monitoring operation in Kosovo when there was conflict on the ground and before the intervention, before the bombing campaign. The mission was dismantled and withdrawn overnight just before the intervention in Kosovo.
I mean, how come? What happened?
Well, the verification mission of that kind requires a baseline. Yes, it requires something to work with, data. And then you look what happens to the equipment, what happens to the fighters. In the case of the Kosovo verification mission, that information was not given. And it was very, very difficult to actually establish what was happening. It was, again, the monitors were not armed. It was winter time. there was fighting going on. They would go out on patrol and find themselves in very uncomfortable positions. So there was a question on whether this mission actually performs what it was established to do. And among the staff of this mission, some felt that it was doing a good job and it just needed more time, but some others were clearly saying, well, this is not helping the people on the ground. It's not helping the actual situation. There's got to be something else that needs to be done. And the actual intervention in Kosovo that happened was done without a UN Security Council mandate. It was an intervention that actually soured relations among a number of countries that had characterized the interaction on a number of other issues for decades to come, really, if you think about it. So that was a really interesting one.
Well, let me ask you further about that, because just day before yesterday, I was in a conversation with Andrei Kamenshikov, a peace activist organizer in Ukraine. Now, he's actually Russian, but he's been living in Kiev for a long time. And we were talking about the soured relations between Russia and the West now. And he said that he thought the turning point, the crucial thing that happened, that the West had not appreciated or recognized to this day, was that it was considered, it was the defining moment when the Russian population really became very hostile and very disillusioned with Western Europe and the US and so on. Because there was an understanding that a country, a region could not secede without the consent of all the parties. And that this was accepted and promoted, at least by the US. I don't know whether you think that was a correct analysis. He said that was the moment when things really had gone bad and have just gone downhill since, but nevertheless, that was the turning point. If so, what was happening in the OSCE on that issue? Were you paralyzed by that, by the fact that you could take a position? What were you trying to accomplish? Whose side were you on this issue?
Well, intervention was done by NATO, but in Kosovo, but the OSCE obviously included Russia and other Eastern European states at the time. They were members of this verification mission on the ground as well. So it was not an exclusive operation. It was established with the agreements of all the states, and all of them represented on the ground as well. So I don't think that you can say whose side you were on this. It was supposed to provide a common way of actually verifying the situation on the ground, and then accordingly also responding to those challenges. It turned out to be a much more politicized issue, and the intervention, of course, changed the situation quite dramatically. Now, the Kosovo intervention has been cited since then in a number of situations when the position of Russia was discussed. For example, Russia was speaking about doing what the West has done in Kosovo when it engaged in war with Georgia in South Ossetia and Abkhazia. And so this argument.
I'm sorry, this was kind of the motivation for Russia, because they were so offended by Kosovo that sort of justified their intervention in Georgia. I'm not quite sure I understand.
I'm not sure that it would have been, I'm not sure it would have been the motivation, but it was an argument that once it happened, the argument was put forward. Well, we're not the only ones doing that kind of thing, you know. Look at what happened in Kosovo.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I interrupted you. You were going to go on and talk about some other conflict besides the Kosovo thing.
Well, one operation that I found extremely interesting was the border monitoring operation in Georgia, along the border with the Russian Federation. It's a very mountainous border. It's you know, it's not the type of border that you would be used to. Very high up in the mountains, harsh winters, no access by roads to many areas, and the OSCE mounted a border monitoring operation where people were actually there up in the mountains looking through magnifying. Yes, thank you.
Binoculars or something.
Yes, binoculars. That's what I'm looking for. Through binoculars on skis, because there was no other way of doing this in wintertime. Observing the movements in both directions across that green border high up in the mountains. That was a fascinating, logistically very challenging, and a fascinating operation, politically also very, very challenging.
Were you there yourself?
Well, I was based in Vienna, but because I was responsible for the field operations, I was there quite a bit on the grounds. I was up in the mountains. I was meeting the people the monitors who were working there in very, very difficult conditions. Access would be by helicopter. Helicopters were, you know, provided by Ukrainian, Russian, Georgian companies, and you would fly high up. Helicopters are not meant to fly so high, so that was always very challenging. And the monitors would live in places where there was really otherwise hardly anybody at all. And they would go out every day on patrols.
Okay, now what good was this going to do? If you could say you could spot somebody doing something looks like a military operation, what are you going to do about it?
Yeah, at that time, the concern was not about a military operation. At that time, the concern was about fighters moving across the border or weapon smuggling. So the accusation was that there were some terrorists who were hiding on one side of the border, and that there would be actually movements across the border.
Okay, forgive me for being too blunt, but it sounds as if the OSCE can look at things but can't do anything about it, what they find. You have no enforcement capacity, whatever, right? And in fact, you're in your deliberations and meetings, everything is done by consensus. All decisions are have to be 100% accepted by all states, or you don't have an agreement. I don't know what happens if you get an agreement, because you couldn't enforce it anyway. But isn't this, doesn't this make the whole operation into, I don't know what to call, I don't have a good word for it, but toothless would be the wrong language, but nothing that can really have the kind of effectiveness that a true governance structure should have. Excuse me for being rude, but.
Well, not all field operations are monitoring operations. Those were the largest operations that the organization ever mounted. So I think Fred and I have put them forward as an example of what can be done. But most of the operations are rather different, and they have a different mandate, and they're rather small, and they do a lot of good in many situations. So this is maybe a little bit misleading.
Okay, give me an example of one that has done some good.
Okay. let me give you the example of the first Ukrainian revolution, when there was unrest politically and in the streets. And the OSCE, together with a number of other states and organizations, suggested a roundtable to bring together the various forces to avoid further deterioration of the situation. And that roundtable actually did have success in contributing to addressing that situation. Or let me give an example of, I remember visiting a hospital in, I believe it was in Moldova, where various communities were asked to come together to actually help establish that hospital as a way of bringing people together, overcoming divisions. And that hospital served all of the communities on the ground. Or let me go to Central Asia, where issues related to human rights, for example, are being addressed by the staff on the ground in a place that, you know, most people don't even care about, don't
where in Central Asia? Where?
The OSCE is present on the ground. Is it still in all of the Central Asian states, Fred? It is. In all of the 5 Central Asian republics that used to be part of the Soviet Union.
Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan.
Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan.
Turkmenistan, I left one out. Okay. Okay. All right, good. Okay, well, then I'm wrong that you're able to do things even if you don't have any enforcement capacity, or maybe you have some kind of enforcement mechanisms that we haven't considered here.
You're right about the enforcement. The organization is a soft organization. It does have a few mechanisms where you can actually move without consensus. These are, for instance, the so-called Moscow mechanism, which was established in 1991, which recently has been triggered with regard to Belarus. It was the Swedish chairmanship together with the Albanian chairmanship, which was just before, so 2020 and 2021, they together, so the Prime Minister of Albania together with the Swedish Foreign Minister proposed to President Lukashenko to set up a dialogue promotion platform in Belarus. And the president refused. And there has been abuse of power and human rights violations. So some states of the OSCE triggered the Moscow mechanism, which means that the concerned country had to allow a special rapporteur to go into the country, to interview people, write a report, and submit that report to the Permanent Council. Now, the problem was that the person who was earmarked was not allowed, he did not get a visa to go into Belarus. So he wrote the report from outside with a lot of contacts he had inside. So that report with a lot of recommendations was made to remedy the situation in Belarus, what kind of steps and measures can be taken to address that issue. So I think that's possible. It's not an enforcement, but at least it was done without the consent of Belarus. Otherwise, I think what happens is you have also in the military field, you have what we refer to, it's called the Vienna document, which is a document which is on confidence building measures, but also risk reduction measures and so-called military hazardous incidences as well. Mm-hmm. Now, what happened recently when there has been a massive concentration of Russian forces at the eastern border and the southern border of Ukraine, that mechanism was triggered by not just by Ukraine, but other countries too. So Russia has had 24 hours to submit information what actually Russia is doing in that part of the neighborhood of Ukraine. And this is a mechanism, again, they're not enforcement, but still they're compelling states to provide information, to give certain justification. And if that's then not the case, and of course that's then beyond the OSCE, certain states within the organization may take unilateral actions. Again, they may go through the European Union for sanctions, they may go through NATO. Let's not forget, all NATO states are part of the OSCE, and all European Union states are part of the OSCE as well. So they may fall back then to these organizations which have more teeth, to come back to your terminology, which I think is the right terminology, and to use these teeth against a country which may be considered in non-compliance with OSCE principles and OSCE commitments.
You mentioned Lukashenko was totally uncooperative. If let's say Lukashenko or any other government would refuse to cooperate, then how would it help to have a report that casts the blame on them for doing that?
Well, I think it's the key is really to keep the issue, let's say Belarus, on the agenda, on the agenda of international organizations. Again, I think there may be some states within the OSCE which feel something has to be done, and they may then, let's say as an example, let's say Germany, that Germany may just go through the European Union and coordinate sanctions against Belarus because of reports which have been made in the context of the OSCE of human rights abuse with regard to the government. So I think that's probably one. I mean, some states may try perhaps to take it to the United Nations in New York. Of course, you may have Russia blocking it if it's really then hitting the Security Council, but there may be a General Assembly meeting, again, where these kind of developments will be brought up. I think it's just the public pressure which is there, and I think for the OSCE, it's really not much more you can do. I mean, the OSCE has different instruments. Again, a lot of instruments are based on consent by the concerned state. Again, you may have the High Commissioner for National Minorities that he's going to Belarus. Well, it's perhaps the wrong example because it's not a minority issue, but he may go to Ukraine, where you have minorities. Like Hungarian minorities, you have actually Russian minorities. I mean, Foreign Minister Lavrov always made the case that you need the High Commissioner of National Minorities of the OSCE to go Ukraine because Russians have been discriminated. I mean, that's his argument. The TV or Russian language TV stations being shut down, etc. So the freedom of media person would have to come in too. They all have their own mandates. They don't need a green light by the Permanent Council to do this kind of actions. And I think it's more this silent diplomacy, which is a trademark of the organization. Again, sometimes it's very hard to establish at the end of the day, did it work or not? I mean, it's like, conflict prevention. It's like the dogs that did not bark. If the dogs did not bark, did they not bark because of what you have been doing the right way, or may have been other reasons for that? So it's all about a bit in the kind of more in the political diplomatic dimension where this work is being done.
Mm-hmm. Do you feel satisfied with the structure now, or what could be, if you were more ambitious and you'd like the OSCE to have more influence and more ability to function well and to actually resolve conflicts, what kind of changes would you want to see made?
Well, I think the one thing I would not like to see changed is the inclusiveness of the organization. Again, you cannot work in a comprehensive fashion if you exclude countries because they violate certain principles. You need to engage with them. So I think what you really have to do is you need a more normative empowerment in certain areas. I mean, Monica made a few references also to work in the field. So far, the OSCE still does not have the legal basis for working in the field of climate change, for instance, climate change and security. This nexus is very important. There's some work being done in the missions, but it's not really considered work which could be part of bigger projects or programs. Then also with regards to women, peace and security, there's not yet a ministerial decision to support that. There's just states which bring it in, the chairmanship brings it in, but there's no plenary decision on empowerment, women, equality, etc. Then thirdly, I think it's all about resources, the budgets. It's the organization for many years has been living with a so-called zero nominal growth. There's no growth in the budget, but the tasks, the work, the demands are growing more and more. And it puts a lot of strain on all the colleagues who work in Vienna, who work in Warsaw, or work in the field. And that has to change. You cannot have a clear delivery of work if you don't have the necessary resources to do so. So just to summarize, I think we need more normative empowerment in quite a few areas still for the organization, and we need the resources to do so.
Well, I love the word normative empowerment, but I'm not quite sure what it would mean. I'm thinking now, you say it would be nice if OSCE had more capacity to work on environmental issues or climate change issues. My impression that it would, certainly something is needed. If OSCE is toothless, the Paris agreements are even more toothless in that I don't see any mechanism built into the system for resolving issues where a country is doing something terrible, really dangerous. Is there any group or body that I'm unaware of that already could do that if they decided to? And my impression is there isn't any such thing. And would OSCE like to take that on if somebody said, "Oh, here you go, it's all yours now"?
Yeah, you mean in the context of, let's say, climate change and security?
Climate change, yeah. Would you like to take it on, and is it needed?
Yeah, well, absolutely. And I think in certain areas like in Central Asia, a lot of work has to be done, particularly when it comes to water security management, but also disaster prevention, natural disasters, even man-made disasters. There's in a lot of countries, there's still a lot of, let's say, environmental hazardous, or even radioactivity in certain areas. Well, the point is, what I refer to with regard to empowerment, normative empowerment, it needs a decision by the states to mandate the OSCE to do so. Right now, if you talk about climate change, there are a couple of countries who would say, OSCE doesn't have to do that. It's the United Nations, or it's another organization, but not the OSCE. We don't want you to do that. There may be, of course, political reasons behind that environment should not be on the agenda, or climate change issues which relate to security. But you need the consensus of all states. And that's why I refer to that. We don't have that yet. I think we need it because the OSCE is a regional organization on the Chapter 8 of the United Nations. That means it can represent the UN on a regional level. So if you have the Paris Agreement, the OSCE actually should be able to implement certain commitments which are in this nexus between environmental change, climate change, and security. This could be part of food security, it could be water security, or quite a few other dimensions as well. Again, right now, some missions do some work in that, but they don't, the organization per se is not really empowered to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So I think this is really where there's a certain frustration. Of course, on the other hand, some people would argue you cannot do everything. Human security, I think actually it's a notion which came out of Canada at the time, I think, in the 1990s. Human security can mean, everything from, from security of individuals all the way to responsibility to protect and issues like that. And the OSCE should also be focused. Again, it's a security organization, a soft security organization linked to human rights. But of course, whatever has an impact on, certain vulnerabilities of communities or individuals, the OSCE should also look at and should be empowered to take action if necessary.
I don't necessarily think I have to take a position on which organization is best able to do it, but I sure want to see something happen. Is there, so far as you know, much effort and much energy going into what I would say an appropriate level of alarmism? Are you aware that anything is happening that may give some more, power to the bodies that I've called toothless?
Yeah, well, I think it's an important question, and I think it's a question which everybody's pondering about in view of the current security situation in the Euro-Atlantic, in the European Eurasian area. Security is really spiraling out of control in certain areas, and there has, of course, been blatant violations of the principles of the Helsinki Final Act with the annexation of the Crimea. There has been other violation we witness now almost every day, being that in the former Soviet space, but not only. I mean, look at the elections in the United States, presidential elections, what happened there, where you have a mob, raiding the Congress, the Capitol, where you had actually the report, the OSCE has been reporting about misuse of digital technology with regard to preparation of the elections, presidential election in the US. So I think you have a lot of uncertainty today across the OSCE. And what's happening is there's an initiative really in the making to look at 2025. So basically in 3-4 years from now, because 2025 is 50 years Helsinki Final Act. And the idea really would be to set up a process now, which perhaps next chairmanship would start. That will be the Polish government, who has the chairmanship in 2022, to really start a process which could lead to a summit meeting in 2025, where all states get together on the level of head of states, and really, in the meantime, work out a foundational document, a document which will be based, of course, on the Helsinki Final Act, but goes beyond that. That there is misunderstandings. Do we need new rules? Do we need to have different interpretations of the rules which exist today? And also look beyond the OSCE about the nuclear issues, about other developments, again, climate change and security. So basically to find a package which could be then accepted and worked on in 2025. And I think a lot of ideas are being now exchanged. There has been recently a publication by the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung in Vienna, which it's called the Cooperative Security Initiative report, which just came out, which brings a lot of recommendations how to go in the cooperative path and avoid a path which could lead to battleground Europe, where you really have a dangerous situation, perhaps possibly even war, or at least, a stability which is very uncomfortable based on deterrence. So I think this is really an area where we should all look at and be hopefully to contribute to this kind of developments.
So you would use that as a largely as a roadmap or an agenda for improving the situation. Would you also, Monica? Are you in agreement with what Fred has said?
Yes, but it's an interesting issue. Here you have a cooperative security framework, and an organization that's light on institutions, with a small budget, that's based on the idea that you can bring these states together around the table and they will work out what the common interest is and apply it. But in fact, the world is becoming more and more acrimonious, and the question is, in how far does that cooperative security approach, how can it adjust and adapt to those very difficult circumstances? And Fred already mentioned that there is work ongoing, but the reality is it's not a straightforward matter. You have to get everybody on board for this. Again, the same issue. You have to have everybody on board for it. And even when it comes to what the OSCE currently is, there will be very, very different notions and different ideas for the future among the participating states of the organization. So this is going to be a difficult process. This is not a straightforward matter. But I think it's very important to say this cooperative security framework, this cooperative security approach, it needs to be saved. This is even when it's difficult and even when there's a lot of question marks, are we ready to abandon something that is based on the notion of working together, on the notion of finding common approaches, on the notion of looking at a comprehensive way of understanding security, not just political military, but a wide range of issues that are connected to each other. And I don't think we should be abandoning that thought. I think we should be working on it, even if it's very, very difficult to do.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, absolutely. And bless you both. Boy, you're in there doing what absolutely needs to be done. And so thank you for your huge contributions. And thank you for being willing to share with me today. It's been fun.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Fine.
Thanks for the opportunity. Bye.
Bye.